Hi everybody, this is Joy at Red Pine Quilt Shop. Today we are going to talk about cutting bias binding, and I'm going to show you the absolute easiest way to cut bias binding. So the first thing to think about when you're cutting bias binding is ideally you're going to have a little bit wider piece of fabric. I like to have 18 inches, so a half yard cut or a fat quarter, so that I don't end up with so many seams in my bias binding. So I have a scrap of fabric that I'm going to cut some bias binding from, and it's 16 inches wide, so it's not quite 18, but it's still a very usable size for bias binding. You wouldn't want to cut bias binding though off like a long quarter yard cut, because you're going to have seam after seam after seam. So definitely, if you don't need much binding, ideally get a fat quarter instead of a long quarter, or a half yard cut or bigger, so that you can get some nice size bias strips when you cut your binding and have fewer seams. So the first thing that you want to do is to square up the edges of your fabric. So I have one of those same size pieces of fabric. I've folded it in half, and I am going to use my ruler to go ahead and square up this edge. I already squared up the other side. I'm looking at my edge of the fabric to make sure my ruler's square, and I'm lining it up with my folded edge here. And I'm just going to go ahead and take off another little sliver on the other side, because you want those edges cut so they are square when you start. And then I'll go ahead and unfold it and lay it out. So at this point, what I am going to do is to look for a 45-degree line on my ruler. The best ruler for cutting bias binding is going to be a nice long ruler like this one. And ideally, that 45-degree line, you want to have a ruler that has that positioned coming out of the corner. Some rulers you're going to find will have that line out in the middle. We want it out of the corner, so we have the maximum length of the ruler to use when we start to cut. So long ruler, 45-degree line coming out of the corner. And what I'm going to do is to lay that 45-degree line down. It's right here. I know it's a little tricky with the plaid, but this plaid is going to make awesome bias binding. But I'm going to line that 45-degree line up on that nice clean edge that I cut when we squared the fabric up. And I'm putting my corner right down here by the selvage, so that it is going to cut right above where the selvage is. And at this point, I am going to go ahead and make a cut all the way across the fabric. So now I've made my first 45-degree angle cut, and at this point I can cut with any ruler from here on out. I don't need that 45-degree angle anymore. I just need it for the first cut. Once I've got that 45 established though, I can just cut. So I like to use 2.5-inch binding, so I'm going to continue to cut 2.5-inch strips, and I will just continue to cut those across. I could have trimmed my selvage off first. That would have probably saved me a little bit of trimming here later, but it's okay, that can get trimmed after. And I'll just keep working my way across, and then I'm going to come back, and I have to rotate this piece so I can cut it. So I am going to flip this one around so I can get a good cutting angle, and I'll do the same thing here. And I will go ahead and again line up at my 2.5, and I will keep cutting strips all the way across. Now, as I cut these, eventually I'm going to get up into these little corners. I try not to use these little corners. I might use this next strip if I need it, but I try not to use those little tiny short strips any more than I have to. Ideally, I would have enough fabric to not have to use this corner or this little corner when I cut into it, because that gives me nice, fairly long pieces of bias binding. So that is the easiest, quickest way to cut bias binding. You minimize your seams as much as possible, and it's super quick and easy. You can do it with any tool. You don't need anything special, and it will get you some very nice, accurate bias binding strips that you can use on your next project. If you have a plaid or a plaid like this, it's fun to do bias binding. If you have anything that you're binding that has curves, you need to do bias binding. So there's times that bias binding is just the best choice for the project. So give this a try the next time you need to cut some. Thanks for joining us for this quick video.